I would put seating depth for me personally as more influential on the end result than something like powder charge or primer selection or something like that.
So if we're talking about jumping, we want to be measuring to the part on the bullet that's hitting the lands, right? Not the tip of the bullet, because it's just out in the bore.
What is up, everybody? Hold on to your seats. We are getting the jump on another podcast. I have Mr. Ian Klemm across from me and also Mr. Scott Parks, and a little play on words there, as you know I like to do, because we're going to talk about seating depth and jump today. What it is, why it's important, how we achieve it, best recommendations based a lot on personal experience and anecdotal things you've seen over time, what's worked for you. Boy, as we always say, you know, there's definitely more than one way to skin the old reloading cat, and people have different views on different things. What are those disclaimers that it's like, these are the...
Your mileage might vary, you know, all of that.
These are their expressed opinions of the individuals and
not necessily the
representative of
the company or whatever.
Mothership. Yeah.
So consider that our disclaimer. And let's go, guys. This is a cool one. Definitely an important thing to look at, to consider, even just to have your cartridges function properly. But also it's something that you can tweak, play with, adjust to get optimal performance. Yes?
Yeah. It's a powerful variable, actually, when we're talking about all the different variables as like a hand loader that you have at your disposal. Sometimes it's one of the last ones that folks experiment with. But, you know, as I look back at my experience, if you said I had to, let's say, go shoot a competition, a match tomorrow, and I had one lever I could pull, I had one variable that I could adjust to be as competitive as possible, I think I'd have to say it was seating depth. You could choose my powder, you could choose my powder charge, you could choose my projectile, but if I could choose seating depth, well, maybe let's say projectiles constant. I would put seating depth for me personally as more influential on the end result than something like powder charge or primer selection or something like that.
Those are strong words.
Yeah, it's a big claim. But this is fun for me to talk about, and especially with Scott. This is the first time we're on a podcast together, but Scott is one of the people that if I run into him at the in a hallway here at work, it's like guaranteed 20 minutes of like learning stuff, to be honest. I mean, a lot of the stuff that I pick up from him is he's really good on like what's the latest, greatest kit and technique and theory and things like that. So this is going to be fun for me to discuss with Scott, because I'm sure he's got tons of experience on his own, and to bounce that off of him is going to be pretty rewarding. So,
walking the halls here at Vortex you can get interrupted periodically by about anything you may be interested in the hunting, shooting, reloading space, because you're going to walk by somebody and you're like, oh, that's the guy that I like to talk to about this.
It's a totally fun thing. Yeah. Yep.
Scott, what are your thoughts on that? You know, I mean, or maybe before we get into that, let's talk like really what is seating depth? Let's kind of get a definition here, you know, seating depth and jump, because they are interconnected in a lot of ways.
Yeah, you could probably do a good job of describing the basic.
I mean, the basic is just where the bullet's seated in the case. Okay. So as you're seating a bullet on your seating press, where that's at. So it's going to affect your cartridge overall length, or COAL. How we tend to speak about it is how far we're jumping or jamming to the lands of the barrel. And that's a little bit of a discussion too, because a lot of people have a different definition of what jamming is. So for me personally, as soon as I'm touching the lands, I consider that a jam point. Whereas some people want to hard jam it, and some will quantify it, like I go off of a hard jam. The problem I have with doing a hard jam, because that's literally like pushing a bullet up there with something as hard as you can and measuring off of that, is, in my mind and in my experience, that sometimes can be, depending on the angle of your throat, could be, you could push it up there an extra 100 thou in some extreme cases from where I'm just touching the lands. So that's like a little nuance there that will just, and I'm sure Ian has an opinion on this too, that we can kind of quantify just to make sure we're talking the same language as we speak. So for me, a jam is the bullet ogive just touching the lands, and then I work off of that. So if I say I'm jumping 20 thousandths, that's bullet just touching the lands, and then backing it off 20 thousandths, so it's jumping 20.
Okay.
If I say I'm jamming 20, then I'm just touching the lands and then seeding the bullet out 20 from there.
So I talk in the exact same terms as Scott. So this is going to work out well.
Perfect.
A lot of people who talk about jam point being neck tension dependent are the other side of the camp that is trying to literally all right, how much force can I put on this cartridge before the bullet starts to slide rearward in my neck? And they consider that like a jam point. But obviously that's neck tension dependent. It's like lead angle dependent. It's ogive dependent.
It's going to be caliber dependent even, just because of bearing surface of the neck. Diameter.
Yeah. We talk about it in the exact same terms. The next obvious question would be, how do you establish the touch point?
Sure. Yeah. So the quickest way I have found over the years, and this is definitely one of those things where I could probably rattle off 10 different methods to do this. This is the one I like to do. Strictly talking bolt action rifles here. Okay. Because I'd probably do it different. Well, with ARs, I'm just making sure the thing fits in the magazine and figure out where it shoots. But with bolt action rifles, I like to take a fired case out of that rifle. I'll slightly bend the neck just a little bit so I can put a bullet in there so it just holds the bullet. I take the whole firing pin assembly out of the bolt and the ejector out of the bolt. I leave the extractor in, and then I literally just push the case forward to where that, and then slowly take it out with the bolt, reach in, grab it out of the ejection port, and measure to the ogive.
And you're measuring
from the base of the case to the ogive of the bullet. So with a comparator gauge. So so if a comparator gauge is literally just a slightly so if you're shooting a 264 bullet, so 6.5, right? You'll have a collar that's, the hole in it is, what are they?
255.
Yeah,
something like
255, 256, something like this, to just to get a consistent measurement for bullet to bullet to bullet.
It's a little bit arbitrary where on the ogive you create a datum,
right?
But it's a reference dimension, so you're creating a consistent, repeatable datum on that ogive somewhere.
Yeah, you're using the same tool every time, so you're measuring the same spot every time, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. So
somebody else's tool might have a slightly different diameter and might have a slightly different measurement. That I think is, so it's just a reference, like Ian said.
Okay, gotcha.
And I do it pretty similar. I take it just a little step further in my case. Well, what I do is I do the same process as Scott all the way up to I don't let the throat of my barrel establish where that final dimension is going to be. I look for a feel on primary extraction. So with that stripped bolt, except for the extractor like Scott described, I'll go ahead and chamber around, and then I'll lift the bolt handle, and I'll be looking for the primary extracting ramp on that bolt action with the bolt handle root to be doing work. You can feel it actually. Without the ejector in, you can feel it really carefully. They'll either be like a little bit of extraction, and the reason why there's work to be done is because the ogive of that bullet is into the lands of the rifling. And so if I feel that, I'll say, well, that's not quite my touch point. That's a little too far. That's technically a jam of some degree, 5,000, 6,000, something like that. I'll go ahead with an arbor press and a micrometer seeding die, and I'll go ahead and push that bullet in an increment, 2,000ths. Try it again. Oh, I can still feel just a little bit of primary extraction. I'll go ahead and seed it just a little bit deeper. And basically, I'll be adjusting it to the 1,000th or maybe 0.5 at the very end till when I lift that bolt handle, I can't feel any primary extraction at all. I know that that bullet is just touching the lands and it's not into the lands at all. And the reason why it's kind of squishy, it's kind of like this gray area, it's this nebulous, like, am I jammed this much or that much, is because the lead of the throat is a cone.
Yeah, the lead angle. That's what I meant to refer to earlier when I said the angle of the throat is the lead
so
angle.
typically, a real common one is 1.5 degrees. So picture a cone, but it's a very gradual cone. And so since it's so gradual and you're putting, I guess it wouldn't be a conical feature. The ogive is it's a splined surface, but it resembles a cone. You're fitting one cone of one angle inside of another cone of another angle, and it's not like this nice 90-degree hard stop that's easy to identify. That's hard to identify. So that's why there's like 10 different techniques, and there's stony point tools and Hornady overall length tools, and this probably appears in your notes somewhere there.
Guide rod stops.
Yeah.
All sorts of methods. Yeah, and I may accomplish what you're doing, because what I do is I tend to take about, I'll do it, say, 5 times in a row. And if those measurements are the same every time, I'm happy.
Yeah.
Like, that's good enough. That's my reference point, you know? Now, if I do it 5 times in a row and I get one oddball measurement, then I do 10.
Yeah.
You know? And then so that being said, if I end up measuring it 20 times, I feel like my threshold's kind of like, and this is just by feel, so it's totally arbitrary, but like if 15 out of 20 of those measurements were the exact same, I'm like, that's good. That's the point. I'll just work off of that.
One of my buddies doesn't have any neck tension. It's a slip fit, but he'll put super glue inside the neck, and he'll make himself a dummy cartridge with a sacrificial bullet, and it'll be chambered for about 5 minutes, whatever the quick cure time is on the glue. Then he'll unchamber it, and that's his reference.
That's his reference.
Another buddy puts like 2,000ths neck tension on, but then he like takes a Dremel tool and he'll cut like 3 slits in the neck so that it acts as like a spring collet.
Yeah.
So there's lots of different ways to do it. The main point, I think, regardless of the technique you use, is to understand that you're doing it to establish a starting point. You can give that starting point a name, touch point, kiss point, whatever you want. But then everything is based off that starting point in terms of what you believe you're jumping or jamming. Right. It's a relative measurement.
Gotcha. The way you're doing it, Ian, I mean, you're just kind of like, pushing the bullet until you are getting that, I guess, relief, if you will. You're like, okay, I'm not feeling that anymore. Is that the point that you like because you want it as close as possible without jamming? Like, are you looking for that exact spot in the thousands?
The starting point.
So it's just your starting point.
That's our reference, because as we get into this, you'll see we probably both have spots where we tend to like to start.
Okay.
So depending on the bullet, I tend to start somewhere between 10 and 25 thousandths jump as a starting point, and then adjust from there.
And I start at 8. But because we're talking about 8 thousandths, pretty small dimension, I want to make sure I'm not fooling myself into believing it's 8 when it's actually, jamming 2 thousandths or something like that. I want to make sure I'm jumping.
Right.
First and foremost. There's times when I jam, but like for the majority of my loading is for competition. And in team competition, you can't suffer a stuck bullet in your throat. And that's one of the consequences of jamming, potentially, depending on your neck tension and stuff. So I want to make sure I'm jumping. But I also want to make sure I'm outside of what I call the like real risky danger zone. And that is an insufficient jump. So that's like someone who's trying to jump 1,000th or 2,000ths. I think that's, in my case, something I want to avoid because there's a
bullet consistency. There's a number of things to worry about.
So that's a good way to put it. Bullet consistency is good, but it's not quite good enough to get that close to the touch point, because the difference in internal ballistics, or the pressure that you drive at the beginning of a ballistic event, between touching or being adjacent to that lead and allowing the bullet to, develop momentum for 2 or 3 thousandths, actually shows up on paper downrange.
And pressure. Yeah.
So if you've got this population of projectiles, and some of them, the base to ogive length is just a little bit longer than others, they're going to vary a little bit. You can't let that natural variance in a production lot hurt you in terms of like, well, that one was technically jamming, whereas the next one was technically jumping. You end up increasing your vertical dispersion that way.
Gotcha.
Right.
Gotcha.
Now,
Yeah, I can see where. You would want to leave yourself a little bit of cushion to
safety margin,
account for that variance.
Yep.
Now, and one thing there's a couple things I just want to quickly that I just thought of while we were talking is, Ian especially is talking about like he needs like the tightest vertical dispersion possible for the type of competition shooting he's doing. Now, Ian, being who he is, probably carries all that same stuff over to his hunting rifles, because why wouldn't you, right? However, you might not have to get this into. I guess my point is like we're talking from an extreme competition standpoint, right? This isn't necessarily necessary for
just hunting. Thank you, Scott. Yes.
One more.
You got me to say it.
And now I forgot my other point. What was my other point?
That was your only point of showing up today, Scott.
That's gaslighting right there. If he's getting you to say it.
Yeah. You know what? You are right about that.
An example of what Ian was talking about that a lot of hunters could probably relate to, unfortunately, is when he was talking about competition, a bullet pulling out. Is if you ever, and maybe this has happened to you. I feel like I've heard you tell this story in the past. You've got a bullet chambered, safety on, then you end up not seeing anything, or you got to take that round out at the end of the day. But you're not done hunting, and all of a sudden you get a freaking action full of powder because that bullet's stuck in the lands.
I have not had that happen.
I feel like somebody around here has. I remember somebody telling me the story, but I could be getting mixed.
So I had a buddy that happened to. He was taking his wife hunting. Her father had, you got to use these hand loads. You got to use these hand loads. And they got on a buck, and I can't remember what happened. But then, so then she was like, I extracted the cartridge. Bullet stayed in the barrel. And then they got another opportunity at all of a sudden, now they do need to shoot, and you can't shooty.
Yeah.
Yeah, not only that, if you don't get all the powder out of there, you're not getting that bolt to close either. A lot of times, well, not to mention in that case, the bullet being in the bore still is really bad. Also, turns out
that's going to be a problem.
Yeah,
but yeah, I mean that does. I mean that makes sense, right? If you really are jamming that in there, and you don't fire it,
yeah, that's why. If you don't want to shoot somebody's hand loads they did for their specific chamber in your gun if you don't know what both guns are what chamber reamer was used on both of them, right? And not only that, I mean, it's just not good practice. I mean, there's too many variables. There's a lot of bad things that can happen. Now if it's loaded to book, and it's yeah, if it's just loaded to book, I don't think I need to elaborate any further than that. Then okay, sure, because now it's just you're buying you're shooting like factory ammo.
Do a trust fall exercise if you need to prove your loyalty to your father-in-law or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Don't shoot his ammo.
Yeah.
It's just not worth it.
But like in regards to that, though, I guess I don't know what the failure point was there in that scenario, but would you be able to feel that, though? Like, when you went to close the bolt, would you be like, ooh, that's tight?
Oh, definitely. I mean, an experienced shooter definitely would have felt it when they were opening the bolt.
Right.
Also.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, a live round should come right out.
Right.
You shouldn't have to
You just got to give her a little bit.
And not to mention the powder just going everywhere. Like you're typically you're going to notice that usually.
I've heard people say, "Oh, this, I've been shooting this bullet out of this rifle, and it really likes a lot of jump." But I've also heard people say, in regards to precision, accuracy, that as you kind of want to be as close as possible to the lands. Do you guys subscribe to like a thing, or you just find whatever the right spot is the right spot?
I would say the latter, in my opinion. I mean, I'm not one to jump a whole lot, but I have some pretty good friends that are better shooters than I am and smarter than I am that do. So like I can't say that's wrong by any means. It obviously works for them.
What I've found is if I'm limited in cartridge overall length by a magazine for a hunting rifle, and I don't want to have to single load, I want to use that as a repeater, then you're artificially starting out with, it could be a 80 thousandths jump. And I don't go into that situation when I'm developing that load thinking like, well, I'm not going to find a spot that shoots as good as if I could get up towards, the throat by 10 thousandths or 15 thousandths or something. Keep an open mind and do the process just like I would. And sure enough, I find, 95 thousandths jump shoots really, really good. And it's one of the pieces of evidence that I've sort of gathered over the years that makes me think that it's not about proximity to throat. That's what we talk about,
right?
Because it's what we can measure.
Right.
It's an easy thing to reference, and we can visualize it. You say, oh, yeah, okay, this rifle likes its bullet to be this close to the throat. But I've got a theory, stress it's very theoretical because hard to prove, that what we're actually modifying is something called barrel time. And that's the time, literally the time that the bullet is, traveling down the barrel. And that's the thing that's providing good results or poor results, advantageous performance or not. And we talk about it indirectly through this measurement called, seating depth, overall cartridge length, amount of jump, amount of jam. I don't know if you've given that any thought.
I haven't given it that much thought. I've given it as much thought to agree with your original sentiment. Whether it has something to do with how long the bullets in the barrel, or if it's really just a pressure issue I think it's probably all related one way or the other. But you're affecting the pressure depending on where the bullet's seated. You've got a couple things affecting pressure. Well, three, I get. Well, no, there's a number of things affecting pressure if you can start talking about cases and chambers and everything. But as far as seating depth is really you're changing the pressure slightly. To get, whether that's to get into a happy node or whatever. One of the things that I was privileged to witness not all too long ago was basically high-speed footage of a cartridge being fired with a clear chamber.
Wild.
And the bullet actually, the first thing that happens is your primer goes off, right? The bottom percentage of powder ignites. Well, that expands rapidly and then throws the powder column into the bottom of the bullet, which forces the bullet into the lands before the powder has ignited below the bullet. So through all of this,
powder is pushing the bullet.
Yeah, yes. And then it goes off. So when everything finally goes off, the bullet's already is in the lands.
It's
an automatic jam.
It's easy to imagine though, isn't it? Because picture the amount of resistance the bullet has to forward movement. It's just provided by an interference fit if you're jumping up between the neck and the bullet. That's all it is. Not a lot of force there. Can compared to rapidly expanding gases from a propellant.
Right.
Some of that powder has burned.
Right.
So yeah, I could totally see that it would move before the rest of that flame has propagated.
Yeah, it was really cool to see.
That is neat.
Yeah, I still don't know what to make of it fully.
Did you I don't know like what the opportunity consisted of, but could you see that projectile moving down the bore? Like how far did it make it by the time like all of the propellant, there was no unburned propellant? Could you see that?
Basically, it got to a point of a hard jam, and then when the final ignition happened, then it goes.
Okay, so like it starts moving through the free bore.
Yep, almost right away.
Yep, okay. And then it slows down or even maybe stops.
Yes, it
Okay.
stops at like a hard jam.
Okay, and the
Like
rest
it
of the
doesn't
powder.
start down the. It didn't. It didn't seem like it started down the board. Like it starts and then stops and then goes. You know, and
Sure.
all this is in milliseconds, right? So
Yeah.
but it's really neat footage. I wish I could share where I saw it and get the footage, but that's probably
You know
not
how
gonna happen.
when you hear about folks playing with lengthened throats, bore rider throats, that sort of style, and they obviously don't have transparent chambers that they're watching this happen, but they have fiducial marks on their case, common pressure signs, and they testify that like, yeah, it seems like I'm getting less peak pressure with this longer throat, even though I'm using the same powder charge and everything else is consistent. Well, you know, what you're saying kind of corroborates that because you're giving yourself a larger combustion chamber by moving that bullet down a ways before it stops again against the lead of the throat. And that larger volume, you know, has the same amount of fuel burning in it, so you have a little bit less peak pressure.
Yeah, definitely. You know, and like, you know, and to that point, like, you know, you see just like if you do, you know, jam 20,000s, you're going to see more pressure than if you're jumping 20,000s. Typically, like you can end up with some case capacity situations where there's kind of an over. I don't know what you'd call it. You know, there also becomes a point where if you keep on seating deeper and deeper and deeper, you're going to end up with more pressure.
Yeah.
Right, because you're decreasing case capacity, but with the same charge.
Yeah, but the influence that bullet retardation has, like keeping that bullet from forward progress, that's way more influential on
there's no
ultimate
cushion.
peak pressure than a little bit less case volume.
Sure.
Yeah.
To what you guys are saying, because there's no relief there, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just
there's no shock
really contained.
Like there's no shock absorber, basically, because the ignition happens and the bullet's already hard up against the lands, right?
Nowhere
Whereas
to go.
when it first starts and
Well, I
you're
guess
not
there's a
against the
place for it to
lands,
go,
you have
but-
this. You have, like Ian's saying, when you're hard seated like that, your peak pressure literally just right from the start is. Whereas if you're jumping 20, it's and then up, and not as high most likely. Well, with the same charge, it wouldn't be.
Bullets have inertia. So like a bullet at rest tends to want to stay at rest. And, you know, if you give it a little bit of a runway, even if it's only 20,000s, well, now you've built forward momentum. And, you know, the resistance it has to actually engaging the rifling is, you know, helped out by that forward momentum.
Do you guys find different styles of bullets, like maybe like a different amount of jump?
Yes.
Okay.
In my opinion, that's been my experience. Okay.
I feel like we're like in a therapy session.
How did it make you feel?
No, my
when you
experience
experienced that?
was. Tell us about your.
What's your truth?
I've had plenty of experiences where I've wanted to freaking punch the wall while low developing.
What's your seating depth truth?
You know, I can tell you that the few times that I've used secant ogive bullets in the past, I found it's just a lot less time consuming and less stressful just to go ahead and jam them a little bit.
For folks watching that don't know what a secant ogive is, what's a common one out on the market?
Burger VLDs. Not the hybrids, because a hybrid is a secant and tangent, hence the word hybrid. So or the old JLK bullets, which are no longer made, but which are the ones I was using actually. That and a bullet that was using JLK jackets, but was more of a custom bullet. But either way, I fought the urge to jam those, but the proof was just in the pudding, and and again, it's not like I was hard jamming them. I could extract them. I didn't have any issues.
Like, were they just touching the lands then?
I
Like,
ended
you got
up
to that point where you're just kissing the lands.
The specific example that I'm talking about. Now, again, going back to what Ian said, you don't want to just kiss the lands, because you can end up a situation where you might be jumping a thou or jamming a thou, or just kissing the lands.
Right.
And those are can cause some things to happen. Mostly accuracy. I don't think you're gonna run into, well, as long as you're not really pushing it, you shouldn't run into a safety issue. But so I started out at about 5, and I shot a match like that. And I just happened to be talking to somebody else that was shooting a similar bullet, and he's like, man, I did the same thing, but I finally just went to jamming 20. And I got home and I listened. I tried the same thing, and sure enough, man, they really started shooting good jam 20.
And when you're saying jam 20, that's 20 thousandths.
20 thousandths, yes, yeah. And that's what I did. For a number of years.
And that didn't give you any issues upon extraction or anything like that?
No, not in that situation.
I had almost the exact same experience. And this was like when I first started loading, maybe 30 years ago. I had a family member who was talking about jumping and jamming and sort of teaching me these things. And I asked him, well, what is your jam length measure? And he said, well, I don't know what the length is, but I jam until I get square marks on my ogive from the lands. And he showed me, and he did a magic marker on his ogive, and he said, this isn't quite enough. And we extracted, and we looked in it was a 4-groove barrel, and the little 4 marks were wider than they were long. And he said, this needs a little more. So we seated the bullet out a little bit more. This is like 2.5 thousandths neck tension. Chambered it again, and they came out, and they were about as wide as they were long. And he said, yep, that's the amount of jam you want. And who knows, maybe it was about 20 thousandths, 25 thousandths. But this was a VLD, not a VLD, like an early VMAX or something, and 22 caliber prairie dog rifles.
Sure.
Yeah. That was the the familial trade secret, for our varmint rifles.
I like that. When you guys, or if you're getting a custom gun built, are you making any special requests in regard to like the amount of free bore?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I buy every reamer that I get something chambered in, 100%, and spec it. If it's not what I want. If they have something already that I want, I'll just buy that reamer.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, typically I have a bullet that I want to shoot and whatnot. Now, sometimes that might not work out, and hopefully I got a shorter throat than I needed for the bullet that I end up having to go to, because then I don't know if Ian will cringe at this or not, but I'll just use a throater and make the throat longer, and that has really worked well for me.
You do it by hand?
Yeah.
I've done it too. They're called throating reamers and unithroaters. It's like
the unithroater,
a little fluted cutting tool that you can go in there and just twist and remove a tiny amount of steel.
Gotcha. So that would be in a case where you had less free bore because you
were going to shoot something that needed less free bore, and now that didn't work, or a new bullet came out that needs a longer free bore.
Usually it's the latter scenario.
So then you need that longer free bore, which is going to require you to remove some material.
Yeah, to get a longer throat. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I feel like that's something we should, Ian, you're way more technical on this stuff, so maybe we should clarify, because I know I flip-flop on this a couple of times. I know you know what I'm talking about when I said it, but maybe we should define throat, free bore, lead.
Yeah.
Oh, you keep talking. I'm gonna make a cartoon.
Okay, perfect.
Let's see if I can keep this
You're not
on
gonna-
while I do it.
You're not going to reenact the knack video, are you?
No, it's not a like
I'm kidding.
interpretive dance or anything. I'm just gonna make a drawing.
Gotcha.
Up
Yeah.
next.
Okay. So this would be, I'll just show the whole thing so people know what I'm talking about. So pretend this is a loose barrel.
I'm glad you're doing this.
All right, so, the cartridge has a body. It's got a shoulder. And it's got a neck. This is where it gets interesting. So in your chamber, make this easier to see, you've got a section called, this is a cylindrical straight wall section called free bore. All right. And that's one of these variables. If you're getting a custom reamer, you can specify and say, hey, I'm going to shoot this really long for caliber bullet. I don't want that bullet, encroaching into my powder capacity too deeply, or maybe I'm worried about, donut formation of the brass down here, and I want to make sure the, bearing surface to boat tail junction is ahead of that donut, so I'm going to spec this free bore out. Then you've got this section here, and I'm just going to exaggerate this so it's easier to see. You've got this section here that's a cone that we talked about. And this is called the lead. And this is sort of like the transition into your lands of your rifling. I'm going to do a dotted line right there. And like that. Okay, so this is your actual bore.
Some good ASMR.
And
Is that what the kids call it these days? Something
this
like
this serves as sort of like an introduction into your lands. So whether it's a 3 groove, a 4 groove, a 5 groove, you've got lands and grooves. So we've split the barrel in half right in the middle of a land. Let's pretend this is a 4 groove. So you've got a land here and a land there. And just for illustration purposes, I'll kind of show if we were to draw the land at 9 o'clock here, it might look like this would be sort of a ramped section, and then you'd see it, start its spiral here. There'd be another one that was spiraling there. So that's kind of the terminology. And when we talk about jumping and jamming, the ogive of the projectile is going to look something like this. And it's the proximity of the ogive to this lead that we're talking about when we say it's off the lead, i.e. jumping. It's tangent to the lead. It's just touching it. So that would be the kiss point or the touch point. Or it's into the lead or jammed. And, there's a certain amount of elastic deformation that this copper jacket usually will experience before it's plastically deformed or permanently deformed. Like you go and pick up a spent projectile at the range and you can see rifling on it. Well, that's plastic deformation of that, copper jacket or copper monolithic bullet or whatever projectile you're shooting. But, there's going to be this region of time between touch and deformation that, is sort of like the big spectrum of jam. So that's why it's sort of like this variable degree of jam that we talk about.
And then throat is free bore, just all of that.
Yeah, so throat would be these two sections, free bore and lead, together. If we say the word throat, that's those two things together.
Gotcha.
And we'll probably do a podcast at some point about carbon ring buildup. And when we do that, we'll draw this again, and we're going to be talking about this region in here where your brass ends, but your your free bore exists.
Little podcast foreshadowing
Foreshadowing, yeah.
for one we have on the books down the road here.
Right.
You've done this before.
I have not. I don't want to do it again. Drawing in public.
Your engineering schematic mind is shining right now, and your artistic skills.
It's freaking beautiful.
You're not going to believe this, Ian. I followed every bit of that.
Did you?
Yeah.
You saying that to make me feel better?
No.
No, you did. That was
Okay.
excellent.
All right.
That was excellent.
Good deal.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Maybe we should have done that earlier, honestly. I guarantee a little bit for myself and probably for a lot of people who were watching earlier, when you drew that, it was like, oh, that's what they've been talking about.
Yeah. So if you've ever been out in the field and you go to chamber around and it feels like it's hard to chamber. The chamber's hard. There's resistance on the downstroke of your bolt if it's a bolt action. It could be that you're jamming this bullet and you're feeling that resistance as, you've got an interference fit now between the ogive and the lead. Or it could be that, this datum from the shoulder to the base or your bolt face is a little too long for your chamber, whether it's the chamber's fault or the munition's fault. My fault as a hand loader. Could be any of those things, but you don't want to have a false positive to say like, oh, this is a jammed round when, you could be feeling a different source of that resistance. There could be a piece of
100%.
debris in your chamber.
Which is why, probably one thing I skipped in the beginning when I was going through my process of finding the lands is I'm not right away putting that bullet in the case. I'm taking that fired case, making sure it freely goes into that chamber.
Yeah, good point.
First.
Sure. Okay.
Yep.
First and foremost, right?
Because if you felt something odd then, you'd be like,
I'm not going to use that case.
you've isolated the variables.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Ian, and maybe it'd be like, well, I'd have to look at it. But I did have a rifle that was shooting phenomenally with a factory load, but I was having to go through, like if I had a box of ammo, and maybe it would have been fine, but like I was getting some hard closes on the bolt, like it was pretty sticky, but only on some. Like some would be like, that feels good, and I'd be like, not that one. I was having to
you can do that. You
segregate, probably about 20% of,
interesting.
of
the rounds from that box.
Would those were hand loads or
No.
Factory. Custom gun?
Yeah.
Could have just been slightly short on the headspace side, possibly.
The other source of that sometimes I found is with custom guns, a lot of gun builders will take pride in having very tight chambers, right?
Okay.
Even if they're using a semi-spec reamer, they'll have tricks of the trade like cutting the last 5/1000ths of your chamber, not under power in the lathe, but by hand, just so there's no vibration. That reamer doesn't cut an oversized chamber. It's the opposite. It's very nice and tight. Well, if any part of this case, is a little bit big, you could be feeling resistance. And oftentimes, it's not the base to the shoulder length. It's, a diametrical dimension somewhere, back at the base.
Oh, interesting.
That's why things like small base dies exist for tight chambers, so that you can get a little bit more sizing down there and you don't feel that interference fit.
Earlier, Ian, or when we opened, I mean, you kind of spoke to like how critical seating depth and jump can be. Like, what would be some examples that you've had of that where you saw maybe a dramatic improvement by making that adjustment? Or I know, and maybe this is related, we did our gear and review podcast earlier in the year. Always a fun one. I suggest anybody check that out. Where you had that tool that you were bringing with you to your different matches. F-Class also, we've talked with you in the past, but Scott, you're like, oh, Ian, you're pretty particular about what you're doing. So F-Class, primarily the discipline of competitive shooting that you engage in, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when that came up in the gear and review podcast, it was specifically talking about taking factory ammo that's loaded to a cartridge overall length dictated by SAMI usually, and changing that length, making it either shorter or longer, to optimize performance for a particular rifle. And, that's something that I've done for friends that don't really want to get into hand loading for one reason or another. But they really have a particular factory load that they want to shoot in the field, whether it's competing with factory ammo or hunting. And they say, hey, I know seating depth can be important. Can you help me optimize the seating depth for this factory ammo? And so we'll do a little test, and I'll have them shoot a series of different overall length loads. And, it's pretty influential with the precision potential I've found. And they're always super thankful. Sometimes there are constraints like magazine length that we have to say, okay, well, this is as close to the throat as we're going to get, and we have to back off from there. But that usually doesn't seem to be like a big hindrance. Usually we can find a length that shoots better than the length that it came at. And so I've always thought that, the SAMI recommended or dictated, I don't know, depending on your perspective, cartridge overall length is kind of silly in a way. I mean, I know they have to probably specify it to make sure the thing is fully defined as a cartridge, but besides magazine length, I stopped paying attention to it when I was a teenager, in terms of, I'm going to load this cartridge as long or as short as I want to based on what I think is best or optimizing things.
So the way I understand how SAMI works is, and I could be wrong on this, is that the manufacturer submits that, and they've, I would assume, have done their due diligence to see what shoots best across all, most factory guns chambered in that caliber that they're working on. Well, if it's a new cartridge, there's not a whole lot of guns.
Yeah, what's the chicken and what's the egg there?
But they're also specifying the chamber, right? So they found with, probably with their bullets and this chamber that this is the chamber they're going to use.
Yeah.
This seems to work the best across the board. That's what they give the SAMI. And then all those manufacturers sit on the SAMI board also.
Sure.
I think there's only a couple actual SAMI employees.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Overall.
I mean, it makes sense that you would need a concrete number. You can't.
This is a short action cartridge. This is a long action cartridge.
Right.
Yeah.
Not a whole lot of room for ish.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I just thought of, not to bounce all over the place, but I think everybody's used that with me. Is when we were talking, what Ian was talking about, when you're chambering around, and it may every once in a while, you get one that feels hard. We were having that discussion, right? I think that just by default, because the industry has progressed, I feel like that doesn't happen as often as it used to in this scenario. But the scenario that I feel like it happened in the most is when long-range shooting was kind of starting to get popular, kind of 07, 08, 09, all the way up till now. And a lot of guys had guns that were, take a 243 for example, right? A couple things wrong with that for long-range shooting if you bought a 243 back then. One, it was the wrong twist rate for a long-range bullet. Two, it was throated for a varmint bullet. So a lot of times there was no throat. It's like the roll of the reamer, and that's it. So if you bought some 243s with 105 bow-tail hollow points or something in it, you're going to be jamming. I'll be surprised you'll be able to get it closed. You just have to work at it, And I feel like that is, if you ever ran into that, and that might strike a chord with people listening, that's something that definitely happens.
Interesting.
I think the 6.5 Creedmoor kind of opened up the floodgates on being, a proper throat long range caliber that was really, it came out as a long range, as a kind of a target round rather than a hunting round. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's used for everything now because it's a great cartridge, right? But that kind of now, these days now you see 243s with 8 twist barrels rather than 1 and 12s, or 223 bolt guns with 1 and 7 twists, 1 and 8 twists, rather than 1 and 12, 1 and 13, 1 and 14. So that, and typically with those slower twist barrels, you're almost always going to have a shorter throat length because it's they're for varmint, but they're for lighter weight bullets.
Right.
So,
yeah, you're talking. In that 243 example, could be the gun maybe optimized for a 55 grain bullet.
Exactly.
And like you said, you're doing something in excess of maybe 100.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah, something you need, 150 to 200 thou, well, somewhere anywhere between 100 and 200 thou free bore, and you have basically zero on one of those guns.
So when you do a test, when you do a jump test, seating depth test, and you find a place where, for whatever reason, if we don't understand it yet, that's fine, but we can say that my rifle likes this seating depth. I would say 10, 15 years ago, when folks believed that it was the proximity of your projectile to the rifling that the rifle was responding to in a positive way, then they assumed this responsibility of, well, I need to babysit that dimension to make sure as the throat erodes, as the throat changes, that I maintain that proximity. It's called chasing the lands. So, there's a bunch of high temperature gases on plasma that are coming out during ballistic event, and it has sort of a flame cutting effect on this section of the steel in the bore. And so this relative dimension is sort of like progressively marching down your bore as that material is being eroded. And so what a lot of people would do is they'd look at their barrel book and they'd say, well, I've shot 200 rounds. I better measure my touch point again using one of these methods we've talked about. And they say, oh, sure enough, my throat has grown by 10 thousandths or maybe 20 thousandths if it's a real fire-breathing Dragon 28 Nauser, or if they were running it really hard.
Yeah,
and
or running around a bunch of dust and whatnot. Yeah.
And they said, well, my magic number is jumping 15 thousandths. So in order to maintain that 15 thou jump, I'm going to have to back my seating stem off my die by 15 thousandths so that my round just got 15 thousandths longer so I can chase those lands as they erode. And they'd go to the range or they'd go to the match, and it wouldn't shoot good. And they said, well, I'm being diligent. I did my job. I maintained that relationship. And that's another piece of evidence, I believe, that supports the theory of, well, it's not really about proximity to the throat. That's actually about barrel time. So regardless of this throat eroding and changing position within your bore, your overall length of your bore didn't change. Your barrel's still the same length, right? Mm-hmm. It didn't get shorter by 20 thousandths. And so I believe that, it's still about, where that bullet is starting versus how much runway it has. And more specifically, I think there are, without getting too deep into barrel harmonics, I think there are good times for bullets to leave the barrel within that barrel's movement during a shot, and I think there are bad times for bullets to leave the barrel. And I think that's what we're finding when we do a seating depth test and when we do a ladder test like that, is actually the starting point for this projectile, given a certain barrel length and other initial conditions, that allows those projectiles to leave at an advantageous point in that barrel's motion.
You're talking about exactly what I wanted to clarify when you mentioned time, and I was like, well, are you talking about just the sheer time in seconds, or is it the time in seconds it's taking, but ultimately it's the harmonics of the barrel? It's the point in time during whatever that barrel is doing harmonically when it's leaving the barrel that is actually the ultimate thing that we're chasing.
That's what I believe. That's my theory. Totally theoretical. We're talking about a time event that's a little over a millisecond. Okay, so pretty fast, but I believe that there could be longitudinal waveforms that are actually traveling down the barrel, traveling back towards the chamber, traveling down back towards the muzzle, and whether the amplitude of that waveform is helping you or in a spot maybe where it's not hurting you at least. That's what we're kind of optimizing when we do a seating depth test. I want to look into the future to see some smarter person than us who instruments a barrel. Maybe the secret squirrel lab that you got to visit the other day will answer that question for us. But
yeah, they definitely know some stuff around there, or at least have theories and have measured a bunch of stuff. But I didn't get to be privy to it. So it'd be really cool to have the money, time, and equipment to try to figure it out. at this point, all we can do is just do what works for us.
We have to be satisfied with like empirical evidence. We go and test, and if we get a certain result, that holds a lot of personal validity with us, and we carry it forward. That's why I don't. Once I find a good seating depth, I leave it there for the life of the bore, and I'll verify it every once in a while. Like before a big event, maybe I'll go to the range and I'll say, well, I better test seating depths maybe 3 thousandths less, 3 thousandths more, and make sure I'm still in that 6 thousandths to 9 thousandths node that I know I should be in. But usually it doesn't change.
Yeah, it's interesting because I wish I had the time and drive to kind of tinker with this stuff as much as I used to years ago as I was learning. Because I can think back, and the reason I say it that way is, there was a time, well, I'll say it this way, I've had bullets that I've shot that I've really liked how they shot, but I felt like after every match I had to retune them. And that would equate to, back then I would chase the lands, but I wouldn't just chase the lands. I'd also add a little bit of powder.
Yeah.
Because I'd noticed that the velocity dropped off and they weren't shooting as good.
So as you were seating the bullet further out, your velocity would decrease because you have less pressure.
Yeah, exactly. More case capacity. Yeah.
And so like my verification checks within a life of a barrel were usually like, well, the barrel's shooting faster now than it was before. I'm going to compensate for that, by pulling one of 3 levers: the charge weight of powder, the seating depth, or these days, actual barrel tuner. Like I could use any one of those 3. I wouldn't really want to change more than one at a time because they're all going to affect, that phenomenon I was talking about bullet release at an advantageous point in the barrel's movement. And so I usually say, well, I know that seating depth is really influential in that. It's a strong lever. I'm gonna use that one to compensate for the fact that my barrel might be a little faster now.
And that would just be potentially speeding up just through use.
Yeah. Yep.
And then, and the reason I just said the way I said it is because now, since I don't have the time, I tend to find bullets where I don't have to do any of that. And over the life of the barrel, the velocity slows down, but the precision of the gun does not. It stays the same, and, that's nice.
Yeah. Yeah. So like in your experience, projectiles are more or less sensitive to.
Well, like I said, it seems that way. But one, I'm a little more, I'm smarter about how I do analytics now. I
based on sample size and
exactly
not jumping to conclusions.
Whereas back then I can just tell you this is what happened. I don't know everything I did up to that point.
Yeah.
I was, and then at a certain point I decided to create a goal of just, well, I know people who do this, who find bullets and never freaking adjust anything.
Yeah.
And the guns shoot great. So I want that, and that's where I'm at today.
I think that's a pretty typical evolution of, precision-minded shooters and hand loaders. We get mired in the weeds because we can, and then we sort of say, well, I'd like to spend more time doing something else and try and cross things off the list.
Well, I think because, like if you have a technical mind, you tend to like to, tinker with stuff, right? But as you do it more and more and more, doing the same thing over and over again, well, that's, the way, at least the way my mind works, like that's not fun. Like doing stuff for the first couple of times is when it's fun because I'm learning.
You're still slaying the dragon, yeah.
Exactly. If I'm doing the same thing over and over again, I'm not finding a better way.
Yeah.
Right. So when it leads, like you said, that's kind of just the evolution, right? You end up to a spot, just like years ago, I was like, can I load precision ammo on a progressive press? And I started testing all that, and I'm like, well, I don't have any more run out. Let's go see how they shoot.
Yeah.
and I've been loading on progressive presses since like 2009 because of that.
Yeah. And you'd be still stuck behind your single stage if you never took that challenge on. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you do have jump, or maybe, is there any risk of like a lack of like centration, I guess? Like, is there any risk of the bullet entering?
That's a speculation avenue for sure, I think. I don't know. Maybe.
I don't think so. I don't think the bearing surface to the freebore is going to, like, that length that you get to pilot between your bearing surface and your freebore is really like I think the difference when we're talking about jumping 10,000s versus 30,000s versus 40,000s, I don't think you see a difference in centration. In fact, depending on how you're sizing your brass, this doesn't necessarily automatically become the long pole in the tent. You could have a closer proximity between a diameter on your body and your chamber's diameter, or a diameter on your neck and your chamber's neck diameter.
Yeah,
gotcha.
So
100%.
I don't think you have to worry about that.
Gotcha. Did we leave anything on the table when it comes to this topic? I'm asking you guys.
I would underscore a point that Scott made that I think was a good point, and that is jamming isn't evil. Like, you can jam to a certain degree and never risk sticking a bullet in your throat. So don't want to give that impression that you should never jam. That's a totally viable position for the bullet to be in, as long as it comes with the case every time you unload a loaded round.
Yeah.
So there's a big area of jam where that's still the case. You're not hard jamming.
Yeah, and I would just to clarify, if you are worrying about the stuff we're talking about, you definitely should be measuring to the important parts of the case and the bullet in these instances, because if you're not, bullets vary a little bit, even in the same lot, right? So if you're jamming, but you're measuring overall length, especially on hollow point bullets, especially hollow point, pointed, any bullet that for that matter, actually, you could end up inadvertently jamming. If you mean to be jamming 20, and now all of a sudden you've got a bullet that overall length, now maybe you're jamming inadvertently 40 or 50,000s. It's an extreme scenario, but it can happen for sure.
So are you saying before you load that bullet, measure your bullets and?
No, what I'm saying is make sure that you have the correct tools, right? So you don't want to measure from base of the case to tip of the bullet. You always want to measure. When we're talking bullets, you want to measure the datums. If you're talking case sizing, you want to measure the datums.
Parts.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
Yeah.
But.
Yep.
So what would be like the important parts, the datums that a person be like, well, these are the things that I need to measure, pay attention to.
So if we're talking about jumping, we want to be measuring to the part on the bullet that's hitting the lands, right? Not the tip of the bullet, because it's just out in the bore. Gotcha. It's not telling us anything as far as jump goes, right? Mm-hmm. So that's an example.
Okay.
So that's why those comparator bushings that Scott mentioned before are something less than the nominal bullet diameter. So if that's a 284 bullet, a 7mm bullet, this bushing that's going to contact the ogive is going to be something nominally less than 284, so that it ensures that it's measuring from this curved surface to the base of the bullet or the base of the case, and not anything else. Yep. So learning what the important datums are, and measuring to them. People are going to ask, well, you didn't talk about how you find, your particular sweet spot or jump length. So I think that I start at 8. Scott, you said you start at?
Depending on the bullet, 10 to 25.
Okay. My increment used to be 3.
So you're at 8 thou off the lands.
Yep.
And Scott, you're being between 10 and 25 off.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I
That's your
used to.
starting point.
Yeah, I would say this with just typical with most Hornady target bullets, most Sierra target bullets, I start somewhere around 20-25. With most Burger hybrids, I start around 10. There's no rhyme or reason that just seems to be what has worked for me over the years.
Yeah. So I'll test in increments, and I used to test in 3,000ths increments, knowing that I could find a good position, every 3,000, in that increment. And then I came to the conclusion that, well, yeah, but I don't want to find a good spot that doesn't have good spots adjacent to it.
Exactly.
So now I test in 6,000ths increments. So I'll start at 8, then I'll test at 14, and then 20, and then 26. And if I get a good result within that spectrum, I'll then say, okay, I got a good result at 20. I'm going to test at 17 and 23 to see, was I on the right side, the left side of that 6,000ths node, or was I right in the middle of it? Maybe I get lucky and it's a 9,000ths wide seating depth node. And if I establish that through more than one trip to the range, I need to verify it a couple times. Then I'll say, yep, it was a 9,000ths wide node, and it was from 21 jump to 30 jump. Then I'll decide, okay, for my match ammunition, I'm going to load somewhere at 25 or 26 or somewhere in the middle of that node.
Same situation that you do with powder.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
I mean, if you load 40 grains, but 39 point, say 40 grains shoots great, but then you load 40.2 and 39.8, and all of a sudden the groups open up. That's not a good spot to be. In my opinion.
Yep.
It's too tight of a window.
It's
narrow.
too tight of a window. Exactly.
Something's going to push you out of it, atmospheric conditions or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or seating depth or whatever.
The
right?
tooling started to wear at
Yeah.
the bullet manufacturer for your lot. Who knows?
Yeah. Exactly. So same principle.
Yeah.
Good deal.
I think that's about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm sure we missed something, but I was just thinking that the neat thing about this is, in 20 years, we could go back and look at this and go, boy, we just didn't understand how this worked at all. But we got the results we were looking for. You know what I mean? Like this, all these theories we have, they could be right, they could be wrong, they could be partially right, but we're getting the results that we need.
Right.
And half the battle is keeping an open mind.
Yes.
Like you have to be in this learning mindset. If you think you've got it cracked and you've got it figured out, that's a disadvantage.
Yeah.
If you realize that, like, hey, my theory could and should change depending on what I learned from you, what I learned talking to you, and everyone I interact with, then you start to get to the truth and you start to narrow in. Over time, the theory gets better.
Well, some of what you were saying earlier, Ian, and even what we're talking about right now, comes back to that saying correlation doesn't equal causation.
Yeah.
You're like, well, the correlation is like I'm seating it this far off the lands.
Yep.
But really what is, so it's like, oh, well, it's this magic distance. Well, no, like you said, maybe it's time. Maybe it's not time. Maybe we'll find out down the road. Maybe we won't care because we will be shooting lasers everywhere. I don't know, guys. I don't know what's happening in 20 years. That's the beauty of it, though. Keeps it interesting.
I think shooting projectiles isn't going away no matter what. I mean, the amount of people doing it might go down over years, but
Primitive
I don't-
weapon season.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you imagine? Your long range rifle is like the primitive weapon season.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it may be that we're 80 years old and we're a group of 6 guys that gets together once a month to go shoot our 45-70s,
Yeah.
except they'll be, what we're shooting right now.
I love it. Well, thank you guys. Always a pleasure having you. I'm glad we were able to get you guys together today. Man, I always learn a ton. It's fascinating, and it's just so nuanced, and you guys are so well versed and have so much personal experience. It's a wealth of knowledge. So thank you so much.
Well, anytime you talk to somebody of Ian's caliber and the stuff he's done over the years, I know he was giving me some kind words earlier, and I'm not doing that just because, but it's just, I mean, he's just a smart dude, he's got the experience, and you're always going to learn something from talking to somebody like that.
100%. And hell of an artist.
Don't quit my day
That's
job.
probably the biggest thing.
Add that to your
actually.
list, Ian.
Cheers.
So, well, awesome. Well, thank you guys again.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for listening. Man, I hope you learned something. I know I did. Like I said, this stuff is just super interesting, fascinating, and boy, seating depth and jump. There you have it. We'll catch you on the next one. Bye.
Cool.
There you have it, folks. Thank you very much for listening. As usual, give this video a like if you liked it, comment something below, and give us a subscribe to the Vortex Nation podcast channel. It would mean a lot to us. Also, why don't you give us a follow over on Instagram while you're at it, at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'd love to hear from you over there, and we'll keep you updated with all kinds of cool photos and videos from our adventures that we do here. Otherwise, we will see you on the next one. Thank you again. Happy hunting and shooting, everybody. Have a good one.